Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this will be my Magicka Sorcerer DPS guide. Magsorc is really strong right now and one of the best damage dealing options you can go with currently. As there are a lot of different ways to get great results in ESO, ultimately you'll have to go with the one that works best for you and your situation. So I went a little bit different route on this one and teamed up with several members of the community to try to get multiple points of view. So I'll start off giving a big thanks to BH Nunez, Rosskag, Wilfer, and Rafavinos for helping out with this one. BH plays on PlayStation and contributed some static rotations for a 2-pet setup. Rosskag also shared some tips for his dynamic rotation 2-pet setup, and Wilfer took on the dynamic 1-pet rotation and gave his tips on that. We'll see some parses from all of them at the end of the video as well. Then Raph helped me out with some really good AoE setups, from basic setups that should work in most encounters to some more niche setups that should shine really well for specific encounters. I'll have links to all of their info in the description below, so make sure to look them up and follow their pages. And as always, I'll have some easier options in here too that I put together, so don't fret if some of the loadouts look a little too complicated. So for this guide, I'll be going over the basics of setting up your character, which includes attribute points, the top race options, the Mundus stone, food, and potions, and then we'll go over champion points, gear setups, including an option for those who haven't done trials yet, the essential passives to take, skill bar setups, several combat rotations, tips to help with sustain, and finally some parses from BH, Rosskag, Wilfer, and myself. Then at the very end, I'll have a special shout out for a really good friend of mine. Last thing before I get started, make sure to give my Twitter page a follow if you haven't already. I do try to always keep it up to date with what I'm up to. Alright, let's get into it. So first, I'll quickly go through the basics for setting up your character. Here are the top races to pick from, the attribute points, the Mundus stone, our top food options, and the potions we'll be using. There are some cases where you might want to use the Thief Mundus instead of the Shadow. I believe if you are under around roughly 58% crit chance or so, fully buffed, you should swap over to the Thief. Most of these setups should have us higher than that though. And then a quick note about being Vampire and the top races. With the skill Simmering Frenzy, you can get some really crazy high spell damage. If you are doing this shrinks the gap a bit because the 258 spell damage that Altmer and Dunmer get is not changing your overall spell damage as much as if you had a lower spell damage amount. So Khajiits really shine in this scenario since they have 10% extra crit damage, and they seem to start matching High Elves' output at about 8 to 9k spell damage. Plus they have some nice health and recovery passives, so they are a really good option if you're going with a vampire setup. Now I'll go over the champion points. This first one is what Rosskag used on the trial dummy and would also be appropriate in a trial setting where you're not needing to bring extra penetration. This second one here is what Wilfer used on the trial dummy and also Wrath used in Sunspire on his Yolnahkrin fight that we'll look at the combat metrics for later. And then this last one is an example of what I'm using in the Kind's Aegis trial without the set Alkosh present. For dungeons and trials, you'll have to find out what your teammates are bringing for penetration and adjust your spell erosion CP appropriately. You'll want to make sure you're hitting that 18,200 mark. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all answer, as there are a lot of different ways to get there and different groups will go about it differently. And for the red and the green trees, these are just generic setups. You'll want to adjust these based on your personal preference as well as what content you're running. You can also find these listed by class and trial at eso-u.com. Now we'll go over the gear. Most of these setups work great for other mag classes too, so feel free to take some inspiration here if you're playing on something else besides Sorcerer. The first setup here is the one that both Rosskag and Wilfer used in their parses that we'll see later. They used 2 Zon, 1 heavy and 1 medium, but Ma the Infernal and Domehouse are also both good options depending on the specific encounter. Then we'll do a 5-piece Mantle of Sororia on the body and Mechanical Acuity on the jewelry and the front bar Inferno Staff. And finally a Maelstrom Inferno Staff on the back bar. Sororia is the strongest Magicka DPS set, provided you can get even a decent uptime on the bonus. It's a lot more forgiving now, building up in 10 seconds instead of the 20 seconds that it used to take. Acuity offers 5 seconds of 100% crit chance and can occur every 18 seconds. Then the Maelstrom has been forever and still is the best option for a back bar because of the nice boost to your light and heavy attack damage. For the traits, all divines on the gear pieces, bloodthirsty on the jewelry, infused on the front bar, and infused on the back bar. For the enchantments, all max magicka on the gear, spell damage on the jewelry, flame on the front bar, and weapon damage on the back bar. Acuity pairs pretty well with Sororia here because Sororia doesn't have any crit chance lines on it, so you aren't missing any bonuses while the 100% crit chance from Acuity is is activated. This is also why we have the infused front bar instead of the more commonly seen precise, since precise would essentially be worth nothing while acuity is procced. The setup is a little more advanced as it does involve working your skills around when acuity goes off to maximize your damage output. With the infused front bar, it is also a little more single target focused than some of the other setups will show, which will be a little better at dealing cleave damage as well. You can do a precise front bar here for a little more consistent damage while your acuity procs aren't going on, but there will be a little less top end single target DPS potential in doing so. If you wanted to go that route though, it is generally best to go with this next setup here. Alright, so this setup is the one that BH used in his 2-pet parse. It works great outside of 2-pet builds as well, and is probably a little bit easier to get good results with than the last setup for most encounters in the game. We'll be swapping in Mother's Sorrow instead of Acuity, and moving Sororia to our front bar. Sorrow is another longtime staple and provides us with a nice chunk of crit chance. We'll also change the front bar trait to Precise. Everything else is pretty much the same, but I will note that 2 one-piece crits for our monster pieces work really nice with this setup, especially if you aren't in melee range for Zon. Alright, this next setup you won't see as often on the trial dummy because it makes it a little harder to sustain, but it works really well in trials where sustain is a bit easier in an optimized composition. I'll show a parse at the end where I used it on the hard mode version of Captain Vrol from the Kind's Aegis trial. This build is mostly the same again, except we're using Medusa instead of Mother's Sorrow. Medusa is nice because it gives us a nice amount of crit chance, and since it gives us minor force, we can drop Barbed Trap or Channeled Acceleration, which both provide that buff and gives us a little extra bar space. As I mentioned earlier, this can make sustain a bit harder since casting Barbed Trap, a skill that costs stamina, gives you a break from a Magicka costing ability once every 18 seconds. Medusa is a heavy set, so we are running 2 heavy body pieces and the other 3 pieces on our jewelry. This means that we need 2 light pieces for our monster set now. You can also do a Medusa front bar and Sororia on all the body pieces and keep the normal heavy and medium monster set, but this way shown here offers higher damage results since the Sororia buff will carry over while you're on your back bar due to it coming from the circle in the ground, while the Medusa bonus will fall off while you're on your back bar if you only have it front barred. This next setup is a great option if you're struggling a little with sustain or moving around too much to keep up your Sororia bonuses, or if you just need to focus on learning the content you're working on and can't be bothered to try and track Sororia as well. False God's Devotion is a nice mix of good damage bonuses and great sustain, especially in fights where multiple enemies are dying. This is my go-to in 4-man dungeons and on some trial fights as well. There are kind of 2 ways you can run it. For a little more damage, you'll have Sorrow active on both bars and False God only on the front bar, or for a little more sustain, you'll do the opposite with False God active on both bars and Sorrow only on the front bar. And then again, this same setup works really well with Medusa. You have to run Medusa on the front bar for a little better sustain, or False God's front bar with 2 heavy Medusa body pieces for a little better damage. If you do go this route, make sure to change your monster set to 2 light pieces like the other Medusa build has. Alright, so those will be what I think are generally the most useful overall and top performing trial and dungeon setups. I didn't forget the Pale Order ring though. We'll do some vampire friendly setups here in just a bit. This next option we'll go over is for those who haven't done any trials yet or don't have access to the trial DLCs. The best monster help options remain the same, but this time we'll pair Mother's Sorrow and Medusa, giving us a ton of crit chance. This works really well because you still get a lot of spell damage from other sources like Major and Minor Courage, Powerful Assault, your Bloodthirsty Jewelry, and your Weapon Damage enchant on your back bar. I found the Medusa staff front bar to be slightly better damaged than a Sorrow staff front bar, but either way you're going to lose one of the 5-piece set bonuses when you swap to your Maelstrom bar. If you don't have a Maelstrom staff yet, you can just double bar the same staff on the front and the back bar. Just make sure that the back one is infused and the front precise. If you do end up going with the Mother's Sorrow staff, don't forget that with the 2 heavy Medusa body pieces, you'll have to go with 2 light monster set pieces again. Some other strong DPS options that perform similarly are Mechanical Acuity, Burning Spellweave, Law of Julianos, Spell Strategist, and New Moon Acolyte. If you are newer to the game, make sure to check out my top 15 Magicka DPS sets video, as it has where all these sets come from and my personal ranking of them. Alright, these next setups will be for those that are running solo or running the vampire skill Simmering Frenzy. For Frenzy gives us an insane amount of spell damage, but shuts off the ability for you to be healed by outside sources. Using a self-heal like Crit Surge is enough to keep it toggled on for a little bit, but not nearly as long as using the Ring of the Pale Order. This ring has allowed for some really crazy high damage numbers in combination with this skill, as it can heal you for enough to outweigh the toggle, plus also mechanics that are happening in a lot of the fights in the game. It's also great for solo content, for just not having to worry about slotting a self-heal and just healing with your own damage. So this first setup we'll go over here is probably the most overall usable one for different content. The one-piece monster set will be either crit chance like Slime Craw in an organized group, one with penetration like Valken Scoria if you're short on max penetration, or possibly something like Doma House if you're running solo and need a little more stamina for your specific encounter. Then we'll run a 5-piece False God and 5 Mother's Sorrow with a Maelstrom Staff on the back bar. The same holds true for running the Sorrow Staff versus the False God Staff that I mentioned earlier for damage versus sustain. And of course, the Ring of the Pale Order will be the cornerstone for this and the next 3 setups shown. This next setup I actually like a little better for running around solo because it gives me a little more bar space. We're just swapping in Medusa again for Mother's Sorrow. Since Medusa is heavy, we'll need to do a medium monster piece in this case, so we'll have the 5 light, 1 medium, and 1 heavy. Everything else is set up the same way. We won't be able to run a False God front bar with this setup since the Pale Order ring takes up one of our jewelry spots, and that would stick us with 3 heavy pieces on the body, and we wouldn't get those must-have passives from running 5 light armor pieces. And I will go over those passives later in the passive section. This third setup here is the one capable of the maximum damage output. Wrath of Enos used this setup on the hard mode version of Yolnahkriin in the Veteran Sunspire trial and got some really great results. 104k single target might look a little lower than what those guys are doing on the trial dummy without vampire setups, but when you factor in that Yolnahkriin flies away 3 times during the fight, and during these phases you are doing no damage to him, this makes this damage per second amount absolutely insane. And like all the other stuff, I'll have his setup linked down in the description below if you want to check out his information tab on this combat metrics report. So for this setup, we're just swapping in Sororia instead of False God. The one piece will be with crit chance like Slime Craw for maximum damage in an organized group. The jewelry can be either Sorrow or Sororia. It's interchangeable since they're both light armor sets. And then finally, if you haven't got a hold of Sororia or False God yet, here's the non-Trials Gear version. All the other sets listed in the non-Trials Gear setup work here as well, but I especially like this one because you get such a high spell damage amount with Simmering Frenzy if you're using it, and the crit chance from this setup really synergizes well with that. Okay, now we'll go over some AoE setups. These are generally used on the non-boss portions of trials if you are swapping gear to maximize damage potential throughout. Again, thanks to Wrath who helped out with some of these. This first section here will be his all-around recommended setup that you can do pretty much anywhere, and then some tips from him to maximize it further. We'll do 2 monster pieces with crit chance, 5 Mother's Sorrow, and then Burning Spellweave on the jewelry and the back bar, and Master's Lightning on the front bar. The body pieces take care of our crit chance, and the Burning Spellweave and Master's Lightning Staff take care of the spell damage. And then here's some tips that he gave, and we'll see some of this in some of the setups I showed in just a bit as well. Deadwater's Guile can be swapped in for more ult burst builds paired with Balorg. False Gods can be used instead of Sorrow if you need more sustain. Acuity instead of Burning Spellweave for more short burst, or Sororia for longer sustained damage. And this is also easily doable with the Pale Order ring, since you just drop one of your monster pieces and slide one of the jewelry set pieces to your shoulder slot instead. Okay, this next setup is the one I'm currently using in Kyne's Aegis. Works pretty well with the ult return from Deadwater's Guile, so I can get a Destro ult off on every other pack for some sections, and even on multiple packs in a row for other sections. And the burst from Acuity is really nice here as well. Here's an example of me using it on one of the trash pools. I pretty much just buff with Channeled Acceleration and then Dark Conversion to give Minor Prophecy to the group. Then I cast my back bar dots. When I swap to the front bar, Acuity will trigger while I am spamming Elemental Ring, and everything crits for 5 seconds in a row. Ideally, I'd cast my orb before my wall and lightning flood. I did those a little out of order, but it doesn't really matter too much. The rotation is pretty simple for trash. And the damage does start to fall off, as you can see, after Acuity drops off, so this is best suited for shorter pools. Balorg is really nice with this as well, as it not only adds spell damage when we use our ultimate, but also spell penetration that can be really useful on these big packs, as every ad can't be fully debuffed by the support. On the pools where I'm just building ult for the next pools, I swap to Doma House since I'm not casting an ult on those. One big downside is that with this setup, since Deadwater is a medium set, Pale Order doesn't really fit in here well, because then Deadwater Deadwater has to move to a staff, and you have to be extra careful not to proc Acuity early if it is fully bodied. It is doable with Pale Order, but probably not as simple and effective as some other Pale Order setups might be. This next setup is great damage for short burst encounters as well, but maybe you aren't as concerned about building up ult for the following encounter. Instead of Deadwater, we're using Burning Spellweave. This is pretty similar to what Wrath had going earlier, and if you want to do what he had and move Burning Spellweave to the back bar and slot the Master's Lightning, you can do that as well. You can also do the Pale Order ring here with Burning Spellweave on the back bar, Acuity on the front bar, and then a one-piece trainee for some extra health to fill in the extra spot. That or Master's Lightning front bar and drop down to a one-piece monster set. What I'm trying to say is we have a lot of options. For longer encounters, if sustain is good, Sororia can be a nice option, and if sustain is needed, False God is pretty great as well. For Sororia, you could also back bar and just front bar the Master's Lightning Staff if you wanted to keep your monster set. Just remember the trait, like Precise or Infuse, is going to be determined by the bar it's on, not necessarily the weapon that it is used. So when you back bar sets like Burning Spellweave or Sororia here, you'll need an extra infused version of that weapon to slot. And then finally, this is a setup I haven't tried personally, but on paper it looks like it could be really nice on pulls that are roughly like 12 to 15 seconds in length. We'll have Elfbane on the jewelry and the back bar, Master's Lightning on the front bar, 5-piece Mother's Sorrow, and a 2-piece Balor. This allows for a 15-second unstable wall and a 12-second Fiery Rage ultimate with Elfbane buffing our back bar dots. I think the extra 5 seconds on the ult could be worth it over some other options depending on the fight length. You could also front bar Mother's Sorrow instead of the Master's Lightning and run a 2-piece trainee for some more Magicka and health, or a 1-piece trainee and the Pale Order ring. If you do the Pale Order ring, you'll need one heavy Elfbane piece on the body, so just make sure to adjust your monster set pieces accordingly. Again, a lot of options here that can all work really well. Alright, so I'm sure there are some setups that I missed, but I think that should give you some of the better gear set combinations that we have to work with. Alright, so a new feature I'm putting into these guides is going through all of the passives that we'll be taking, explaining which ones are needed and why they are important. I know a lot of the more experienced players won't really need this section, so that's why I made sure to have timestamps for all of this, so you can just skip right past it if you want. But there might be something to learn here for veterans too. Oh, and I always get questions about this. The add-on I'm using here for the skill window to show everything at once is called Perfect Pixel. Well, I'll go ahead and get right into it. We'll start with the class passives and then go through the ones that will be needed in the other skill lines as well. First, in the Dark Magic skill line, we have Unholy Knowledge. This reduces the health, magicka, and stamina cost of your abilities by 6%. This one is pretty self-explanatory, it just makes your abilities cost less. Great for helping with sustain. Next, we have Blood Magic. When you hit an enemy with a directly applied Dark Magic ability, you heal for 1957. This effect scales off your maximum health and can occur once every 0.5 seconds. This is one of the less important passive abilities we have, as the heal isn't really too necessary or noticeable in group content. The main way we trigger this is with the ability Crystal Fragments. We'll get into that ability a little more later, but if you're only using it for its secondary function, it isn't too consistent of a heal to keep you up for when you're running solo. If you are using Crystal Fragments as your main spammable ability though, this is an okay small extra heal coming in, but really again only for solo stuff or content where you aren't having a healer healing you. Even then, still one of the weaker passives considering some of the other heals we have access to in the game, so if you're running low on skill points or just leveling a sorcerer, this is one you can save toward the end of the process. Next we have Persistence. After blocking an attack, your next health, magicka, or stamina ability costs 15% less. This one doesn't show up too much as a damage dealer. There are a few fights where you have to block a lot, notably the final boss in Halls of Fabrication, where you might actually see a noticeable sustain boost from this, but this is generally more obvious in PvP and for those that are running in PvE as sorcerer tanks. This is another one you can save toward the end of leveling up. And last up in this skill line is Exploitation. When you cast a Dark Magic ability, you grant Minor Prophecy to you and your group, increasing your spell critical rating by 1314 for 20 seconds. This is huge and one of, if not the most important passive that Sorcs have. This gives everyone in your group 6% extra crit chance for their magicka abilities. It's the reason you always want at least one sorcerer in your group if you're running a magicka based composition. 6% crit chance when we have access to so much extra crit damage in the game is a really huge damage boost and really noticeable when a group is missing it. The main way we'll activate this again is with the ability Crystal Fragments, and I also like to cast Dark Conversion once right before the start of fights. It not only gives me a little extra sustain to start the fight off with, but gives the group that 6% crit chance, which buys me a little time to hit my first Crystal Fragments without worrying about the group not having the buff. Alright, now on to the Daedric Summoning skill line. Our first passive is Rebate. You restore 300 Magicka or Stamina when one of your non-ultimate Daedric Summoning abilities end. The resource returned is dictated by the ability's cost. So it's saying if the ability costs Magicka, it returns Magicka. If it costs Stamina, it returns Stamina. This isn't huge, but you can essentially subtract this amount off the cost of each ability in that skill line that you cast. So for example, my Volatile Familiar costs 2983, well with this passive it essentially costs 2683. Useful passive for sure, but I'm really not a fan of these kinds of passives. I'd rather see the skills just cost what they cost and then this be used for something more unique and interesting. Anyways, definitely a good one to have though to help out with sustain. Next up we have Power Stone. Reduce the cost of your ultimate abilities by 15%. This one is pretty great, although not as cut and dry great as it looks. Most classes do have some way of building ultimate faster as a class passive, and Sorcs instead have the cost reduced. It is still really nice and doesn't rely on you doing anything to get there. It's just always cheaper, which is great. As examples, this brings the cost of your Destruction Ultimate or Barrier down to 212 when they are normally 250. One of the better passives to grab for sure. Next we have Daedric Protection. Increases your health and stamina recovery by 20% while you have a Daedric Summoning ability slotted. This one isn't too important for Magsorc for PvE. It is really nice for a Stamina Sorcerer though. It will be one of the last ones you worry about grabbing as you level and get skill points. Next is Expert Summoner. Increases your maximum health by 8% while you have a Daedric Summoning pet active. This one is pretty great and gets you to some really nice health levels if you have at least one pet out. Definitely one of the better passives to grab, and one of the many reasons that it is good to have at least one pet in your build. For our last Sorcerer skill line, we have Storm Calling. The first passive is Capacitor. Increase Magicka recovery by 10%. This is great, but I kind of wish they'd just combine this with Daedric Protection, the one that gives health and stamina recovery. Then you could just have one passive that is useful for all builds, and turn this into something else unique, instead of splitting the recovery usefulness across two different passives. Still nice to have though. Next is Energized. Increase your physical and shock damage by 5%. This passive is pretty good for some extra damage, but it's much better on Stamsorc than it is on Magsorc. Stamsorcs usually end up with about 80% or more of their damage being physical damage, but a Magsorc usually only has like 20 to 30% of their damage being shock damage. Still really nice to have, but usually won't have an insane impact on your DPS levels. It's still a good boost though. Amplitude, this one is pretty juicy. Increases your damage done against enemies by 1% for every 10% current health they have. So pretty much the very first hit against an enemy will deal 10% extra damage, then from 99% health to 90% health, you'll deal 9% extra damage. From 89% health left to 80% health left, you'll deal 8% extra damage, and so on. It's essentially a reverse execute ability. Sorcerers having this can really help push the front end of a fight faster, as it's a pretty big damage increase. One of the best passives to grab for sure. And then for the last class passive, we have Expert Mage. Increases your weapon damage and spell damage by 2% for each sorcerer ability slotted. This does include skills from all three skill lines. This one is pretty juicy too, especially with how high spell damage levels can get to in today's version of ESO. With a pretty standard bar setup, you're looking at somewhere between 8 to 12% increased spell damage from this. So a 4000 spell damage setup is going to get you 400 extra spell damage or so. Not really much to say about it, it's just really nice and another must grab passive. Now we'll go through the Destruction Staff passives. The first is Trifocus. We'll mainly focus on the first two here, as those are the DPS oriented ones. Fully charged Flame Staff heavy attacks deal 12% additional damage. Shock Staff heavy attacks damage nearby enemies for 100% of the damage done. We typically aren't doing a lot of heavy attacks unless we need some sustain help. This is still nice to have for when that does come up. Next is Penetrating Magic. Your Destruction Staff abilities ignore 10% of the enemy's spell resistance. This one is generally not too useful in PvE, as you should be aiming to hit the penetration cap already. You will see some very minimal results when enemies aren't debuffed fully, but this will be one of your later passives to worry about grabbing when you're setting up. Next up is Elemental Force. Increase your chance to apply elemental status effects by 100%. So for example, if you're using a flame glyph, you'd have a base chance of 20% for that glyph to proc burning, and this passive boosts it to 40%. This is a pretty nice one to have, as burning increases our damage by a pretty good bit, and the other debuffs like concussed from shock damage can be nice to help provide on large packs of enemies as well. If you want a full rundown of the status effects and your chances to proc them, you can check out part 2 of my complete PvE damage dealer guide. I'll have it linked in the description. Next up is Ancient Knowledge. Again, we'll focus on the first first two DPS parts of this passive. Equipping a Flame Staff increases your damage done with single target abilities by 8%. Equipping a Lightning Staff increases your damage done with area of effect abilities by 8%. This passive is active while you are on that specific bar. So for example, if you cast your Unstable Wall from a lightning back bar, then swap to your front bar, which is a Flame Staff, that AoE ability will not be boosted by the 8%, even though your back bar is a lightning staff. It will only boost that ability type while you're on that bar. This is one of the several reasons you typically don't see damage dealers running lightning staff back bars in organized group content. Even for AoE encounters, it is more common to see a Flame Staff back bar and a lightning staff front bar to take advantage of the AoE damage while you're on your active bar. This is a must-have passive and a nice chunk of extra damage. And finally, we have Destruction Expert. When you kill an enemy with the Destruction Staff ability, you restore 3600 Magicka. When you absorb damage using a Destruction Staff damage shield, you restore 1800 Magicka. So that's referring to the Ice Staff shield. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. The first part here does require you to get the killing blow, which is great for solo content, but can be hit or miss for group content. Still really nice to have though for when it does trigger. The second half here about the damage shield, this also works if someone else in the group applies the damage shield to you. So just some more free sustain you can get. Really good passive to have all around. Alright, now we'll go through the light armor passives. First we have Grace. Reduces the effectiveness of snares applied to you by 4% per piece of light armor worn. Current bonus 20%. Reduces the cost of sprint by 3% per piece of light armor worn. Current bonus 15%. These numbers are with me wearing 5 light pieces of armor. This one isn't too huge for PvE, but can be a nice quality of life one. You can set this one to the back end of your passives to grab when leveling up, or hold off if you're short on skill points. Evocation, on the other hand, is pretty huge. Increases your Magicka recovery by 4% for each piece of light armor equipped. Current bonus 20%. Reduces the Magicka cost of your abilities by 2% for each piece of light armor equipped. Current bonus 10%. This will be a must-have to sustain throughout a fight. Usually one of the first passives I fill out as I'm leveling up a new character. Next is Spell Warding. Increases your spell resistance by 363 for each piece of light armor equipped. Current bonus 1815. Again, this number comes from wearing 5 light pieces. Not a make or break passive for the build, but this amount of spell resistance comes out to almost 3% reduced damage taken from spells, so it's pretty nice to have. These last two are the big ones for damage, and the reason why Magicka builds need at least 5 pieces of light armor. Prodigy. Increases your spell critical rating by 2191. And notice it does have the note above it saying when 5 or more pieces of light armor are equipped. This comes out to 10% increased critical strike chance. If you're ever wondering how to get from a spell critical number to the amount of crit chance that number represents, just divide it by 219. 100% crit chance is 21912 spell critical. Grab this passive as early as you can. It is a must-have for higher damage numbers. And then Concentration. When 5 or more pieces of light armor are equipped, increases your spell penetration by 4884. This is another really big one and allows for Magicka builds to get to the penetration cap of 18,200 a little bit easier than stamina builds. Another must-have passive. For medium armor, none of these are necessary, but I do like athletics pretty well, especially when I'm using a speed build to run between ad waves. This lets me wear just 2 medium pieces of armor with my Ring of the Wild Hunt and get to the move speed cap of 100% additional movement speed while sprinting without needing any other speed gear. We get 40% from sprinting, 45% from the Wild Hunt ring, 7% from Swift, 6% from this athletics passive, and the last 2% from the wind running passive in the lover tree in our champion points. For the heavy armor passives, I usually grab the first 3. Resolve is not too huge since we're typically only wearing 1 to 2 pieces of heavy armor, so this will equate somewhere between 0.5% to 1% physical and spell mitigation, depending if we're wearing 1 or 2 pieces of heavy armor. The Constitution passive is also not too huge, especially the health recovery portion here. The second half though, you restore 108 Magicka and stamina when you take damage for each piece of heavy armor equipped. This effect can occur once every 4 seconds. While it isn't a ton, it's still free resource return, so not a top priority passive to get, but definitely one you should end up with as it is still beneficial. And the last one here is the most noticeable, and it is Juggernaut. It increases your max health by 2% per piece of heavy armor equipped. Not a lot to say about it really. Bigger health pools should lead to less deaths, hopefully. The next skill line we'll look at is Fighter's Guild. The passives you'll need here will kind of depend on if you're using the skill Barbed Trap or not. If you are, the first one can be nice to have as it will reduce the stamina cost of it by 15%. There are some situations where you might want Barbed Trap to cost the full amount. If you're running Martial Knowledge to buff your group, for example, and you're having trouble keeping your stamina low. The next passive we'll want is Banish the Wicked. You generate 9 ultimate when you kill an undead, daedra, or werewolf. This does require the killing blow, so won't show up as much in 12-player content, but every little bit of ult helps, and it is especially noticeable in solo or small groups when running content with undead, daedra, and werewolves. The last passive you might want to get if you're running Barbed Trap is Skilled Tracker. Your Fighter's Guild abilities deal an additional 20% damage to Undead, Daedra, and Werewolves. Barbed Trap doesn't do a lot of damage as a Magicka DPS, so having an extra 20% to it is probably not very noticeable, but if you have some extra skill points and you're trying to squeeze out every last bit you can, it is a non-zero improvement. I wouldn't worry about it though unless you have plenty of free skill points. Now on to Mage's Guild. The first passive here is just for questing. It can be nice to speed things up if you're doing the quest, but I don't really do quests on this particular character, so I don't have it unlocked. Mage's Adept reduces the magicka and health cost of your Mage's Guild abilities by 15%. It's really only useful if you're using one of the active abilities, Entropy, Fire Rune, or Equilibrium. If you are, make sure to take it. If you aren't, you can hold off on it. Everlasting Magic is similar as it increases these ability lengths by 20%, but this also extends to the Meteor Ultimate as well. If you aren't using an active ability, again, you can skip over it for now. Magicka Controller is nice if you are slotting any of the abilities from this line, whether passively just for the bonus or actively used abilities. If you aren't, you can skip this. And then Might of the Guild gives you Empower for 3 seconds after using a Mage's Guild ability. As with the other passives, only useful if you're actively using a Mage's Guild ability. So really this whole skill line will kind of depend on your personal setup as to whether it's useful or not. Next up is the Psijic Order skill line. This one is sort of optional as you can get by without it and still do great DPS, but it does have some nice abilities if you have the DLC unlocked to get it. If you do have it, the first passive is automatically unlocked when leveling the skill line and just allows you to interact with and loot the Psijic rifts throughout Tamriel. Clairvoyance is a great one to have as it will reduce the cost of both elemental weapon and channeled acceleration. Next is Spell Orb. When you cast a Psijic Order ability while you are in combat, you generate a spell charge. When you reach 5 spell charges, you launch a Spell Orb at the closest enemy to you, dealing 4302 magic damage or 1709 physical damage, whichever is higher. Spell charges must be generated within 10 seconds of each other or all charges will be lost. This one isn't huge, but is just a little bit extra damage if you're using elemental weapon. If you're only using channeled acceleration from this skill line, you won't need this passive as you won't cast it often enough to make use of it. Concentrated Barrier is pretty nice and has saved my butt a few times. While you have a Psijic Order ability slotted and are bracing, you gain a damage shield that absorbs 5,000 damage. This damage shield recharges back to full strength after you spend 10 seconds not bracing. This is just referring to when you hold block. I've definitely had a few cases where that extra 5k shield made the difference in life or death. Not a passive I'd grab ahead of damage dealing ones if I'm still short on skill points, but great to have if you have a Psijic ability slotted. And then finally we have Deliberation. When you're casting or channeling a Psijic Order ability, you gain major protection, reducing your damage taken by 10%. This is really only noticeable when you're using channel acceleration, but even then it isn't too huge of a buff. If you have spare skill points, sure. If not, don't worry too much about this one. The next skill line is Undaunted. You'll want to max both of the passives here. The first is Undaunted Command. Activating a synergy restores 4% of your maximum health, stamina, and magicka. Current bonus 783 health, 401 stamina, and 1403 magicka. This might not seem huge, but in a trial environment where you are getting a lot of synergies coming in, this can definitely make or break whether you can sustain your resources throughout a fight or not. For example, if we look at the combat metrics for a long 10-minute hard mode fight against Fallgraven in Kyne's Aegis, I ended up taking 59 synergies total, which came out to 129 magicka per second. That ended up giving me more magicka back than minor magicka steal even. Obviously this passive will be a little group dependent and also depend on you to grab synergies, but can definitely be a huge boost if used correctly. The second passive is Undaunted Metal. This is the reason we try to go 5 light, 1 medium, and 1 heavy in our builds whenever possible for Magicka DPS. Increases your maximum health, stamina, and magicka by 2% per type of armor, heavy, medium, and light that you have equipped. Current bonus 6%. Extra magicka means more damage, and since we don't have any light armor passives that increase our damage per piece equipped, this is how we get more damage past the initial 5 light pieces. Next up are our racial passives. I won't go too in depth here as these will vary from race to race, but there aren't any races where you won't just take all of these. And then finally, you want to make sure you have the medicinal use passive in the alchemy skill line. When using potions, resulting effects last 30% longer. What this does is carry the length of our potions to just long longer than the cooldown to drink them, so we have 0 downtime on the buffs they provide. Definitely a must-have for both sustain and damage. And the other passives here are all for crafting. They're nice if you do crafting, but not essential for combat. Alright, now we'll go over our skill bars. For our 2-pet setup, if we're not using Medusa, we'll be running Twilight Tormentor, Volatile Familiar, Daedric Prey, and then our spammable, then Crystal Fragments, then either Greater Atro or Shooting Star. On the back bar, we'll run Twilight Tormentor, Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, then either Barbed Trap or Channeled Acceleration for minor force, and then the Volatile Familiar. And then our ultimate on our back bar is going to be either Fiery Rage or the Greater Storm Atro again. You'll see this is the setup that Rosskag used on the trial dummy for his 107k parse. He did slot Boundless Storm over Mystic Orb to help sustain better, because Mystic Orb is really tough to sustain on the trial dummy. For choosing which spammable, generally we'll go with Elemental Weapon if we want more single target damage, Force Pulse for some more cleave damage, and then Arterial Burst if we are going Vampire. And this is because the other morph Blood for Blood, since it doesn't cost Magicka, it will not proc Crystal Fragments. Before we get into any other bar setups, I did want to quickly talk about using Crystal Fragments as your spammable. So because they reduced the time on Crystal Fragments to 0.8 seconds and added in a feature to where it can proc its secondary form as well, it actually can be used as a spammable, sort of like spamming Wrecking Blow, and it gives you a little bit more bar space to work with. So here's an example bar setup if we are using Crystal Fragments as our spammable. You see we have room to slot Bound Aegis now, which gives us a bunch of extra Magicka, which in turn gives us some more damage. It's a little weird to weave, you know, it's not an instant cast ability, so it could hurt your DPS if you're going too slow with it, but it's one of those things, if you just kind of ignore the animation and go with it, it's definitely doable. And because of the long animation, it is a little tough to bar swap off of. You have to wait that 0.8 seconds before you can activate your bar swap, whereas with an instant cast ability, if you needed to bar swap, you could instantly do it as soon as you cast it. So it does feel a little bit clunky there too. Because of this, you'll want to try to end your front bar with either the Familiar or Daedric Prey or your ultimate or the Crystal Frag secondary proc even. Something else with an instant cast so that you can quickly bar swap off if possible. And then the last thing I wanted to note about it, it does have a 10% cost reduction built in. So whenever you cast it, your next ability you cast gets a 10% cost reduction. So it can actually help with sustain quite a bit as well. You can run it with any of these setups that I'll show, but just keep in mind, if you do need some more AoE damage, Force Pulse is probably a better bet. And then for fights where you might have to block a lot, it's gonna be a little annoying to use as well. If you want to see a full guide on using Crystal Fragments as your spammable, Rebel X did a really nice video on it. He got a really monster parse with this setup and really explained what he was doing really well. So definitely recommend checking that out if you do want to go that route. I'll put the link down in the description below. Alright, moving on with the other bar setups. If you do run Medusa, the setup is pretty much the same, except you won't have to run Trap or Channeled Acceleration on the back bar, and you can fit both Orb and Boundless Storm there. And you'll see this is what I'm doing on my Captain Vrol parse that I show later on. The Boundless Storm can sort of be a flex spot for you as well if you need something else, so Dark Conversion can be flexed if your sustain is suffering, Critical Surge can be flexed if more healing is needed, a shield could be flexed there as well. That spot would also be the ideal spot if you're running Simmering Frenzy as a vampire. For the 1-pet non-Medusa setup, the bars are pretty similar again. Instead of the Volatile Familiar on the front bar though, we have Bound Aegis. And then on the back bar, instead of the Volatile Familiar, we have Trap or Channeled Acceleration and Boundless Storm both slotted. The same thing applies for the abilities that we could flex in here. And then I also wanted to note, Mage's Wrath can be good situationally, but it's often beat out by just slotting Bound Aegis. You can kind of go with either one in that front bar slot though. And then for the Medusa setup, it doesn't shine as much as it does in the 2-pet setup since you already do have a little more bar space, but it does free up another flex spot on the back bar. So with Simmering Frenzy or something like that, you could still have all your back bar dots run and not have to give up anything. And then finally for the non-pet setups, like I said earlier in the video, it is recommended to at least run 1 pet, but if you really don't want to, you're going to swap over Daedric Prey for Haunting Curse, and then you'll double bar Bound Aegis, and then you'll have a flex spot on your front bar to either run Inner Light or Mage's Wrath, depending on what you need there. And yeah, you just have a lot more bar space really. And then again, if you do run Medusa with this, you'll just end up with that 1 extra bar spot on the back bar. Now I'll go over the AoE skill bar setup. So the front bar will have Bound Aegis, Camo Hunter, Mage's Wrath, Elemental Ring, Inner Light, and then Greater Storm Atro. And then on the back bar, we'll have Dark Conversion or Daedric Tomb, Unstable Wall, Lightning Flood, Mystic Orb, Channeled Acceleration, and then the Destra Ultimate Fiery Rage. I typically prefer Dark Conversion here, as this is the way to give our group Minor Prophecy, so I'll pre-buff that and Channeled Acceleration, then throw out my Orb, and then start my rotation with Unstable Wall, then Lightning Flood, and then spam Elemental Ring on my front bar, and then if I need to go back and reapply my back bar dots and the trash isn't dead, then I do that. Couple of notes here: Shot Clinch will be slotted if you're using the Master's Lightning Staff, and then Proxy Detonation can be nice as well on tight stacks when you can stand in melee range. And then Simmering Frenzy will be slotted here if you are using a vampire build. Alright, now we'll go through the rotations. I'll start with the more advanced ones, but we'll show some intermediate and beginner ones as well. This first one will be the 2-pet advanced rotation that Rosskag used in his 107k parse with mechanical acuity. So he opens up by pre-buffing the Twilight Tormentor, dropping his ultimate off to the side, and then a trap, and then starts the light attack weaving with Unstable Wall, Boundless Storm, and then normally we'd see the pet activated on the front bar, but what he's doing here, since he's using Acuity, he's going ahead and activating on his back bar so that his front bar is mostly just spammables. Then we'll have Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, and Daedric Prey, and then reapply our wall, then go back to another spammable, reapply the Volatile Familiar, 2 spammables, and then Daedric Prey again. Then he reapplies his trap, and then 2 more spammables, and really from here on out, it's just a fully dynamic rotation. He's watching his timers, he's keeping up everything as close to 100% as possible, and a special thing that he's doing, since he is wearing Acuity, if he sees that it's about to re-trigger, he might swap back to his back bar maybe a second early to make sure that that doesn't happen right before he's reapplying dots, so that when he goes back to his front bar, he's hopefully just doing all spammables. So just a few notes about it: the Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff. The Greater Storm Atro will be cast whenever ready and no dots need recasting. And then our spammable is cast whenever nothing else needs reapplication. And then in a raid, if you can sustain it, Mystic Orb should replace Boundless Storm. If you want, you can pair it with Unstable Wall, since both are 10 seconds long, or you can just keep them up separately dynamically as well. And then, as I mentioned, when wearing Acuity, try to line it up to trigger when your dots are active and you're just doing spammables. The second setup here is also for 2 pets. It's just a little bit different if you're not wearing Acuity. I won't go through it all again. It's just a different order on the initial skills. And of course, these will all be down in the description as well if you want to go over them. But all of the notes here are pretty much the same. We'll just have a slightly different cast order. And then Barbed Trap is dropped if you're running Medusa, which would allow for both Orb and Boundless Storm to be used. Alright, now we'll go to Wilfer's 1-pet rotation. So the opening will be the Twilight Tormentor, Boundless Storm, the ultimate off to the side, and then Trap, and then we will start light attack weaving with our Unstable Wall, Degeneration, and then bar swap into Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, Daedric Prey, 2 spammables, and then we will bar swap into Unstable Wall, bar swap 1 spammable, bar swap back and reapply Degeneration, bar swap back and reapply our Daedric Prey. And then, like the 2-pet advanced rotation, he's just going to keep up all of his abilities as close to 100% as possible. Just keep them all up dynamically. The notes here are pretty much the same as before, but we do have an optional execute now, since we do have some more bar space to run Endless Fury or Mage's Wrath. So it will replace your spammable at 20%. And at this point, you'll drop Degeneration, Daedric Prey, and also Boundless Storm if you're going to get less than 17 seconds from it. So you'll continue to fire your Crystal Fragments after 20% though, even if you are running an execute. These advanced ones might look a little more difficult on initial glance than they actually are. There's really not too many skills to keep up, especially if you run Medusa and can drop Trap. So really you only have a few skills to keep up dynamically, and then Wall and Orb will end up on the same exact timer if you want to do it that way. It seems a little daunting, but like once you practice it and start messing with it, it really isn't too much to keep up. Of course, if you're a newer player or you're still learning content, sometimes trying to do the mechanics of the content and keep up a dynamic rotation's a little much, and it's easier just to have something that repeats exactly the same over and over again. I understand that console, it's a little more difficult to do a dynamic rotation, so we did have BH Nunez come in and do some static ones for us that he uses on PlayStation, so I'll go ahead and share those now. So for his 2-pet rotation, he's opening with Twilight Tormentor, casting his ultimate, and then Barbed Trap. And then this is the repeating part. It just repeats over and over. It's Daedric Prey, Unstable Wall, Degeneration, and then 3 spammables, and then Daedric Prey, and then 5 spammables. And then that just repeats over and over. It is a 12-second rotation. So he's using Degeneration here over Orb because Sustain is pretty rough. So this is the easier Sustain version. He's actually not casting his Volatile Familiar either. He's just using it for the passive damage. So this is a much easier to sustain version. If you do have pretty good sustain, he also submitted a higher damage version, and it would be Daedric Prey, and then you bar swap to Unstable Wall and Mystic Orb. And then you bar swap to your Volatile Familiar, 2 spammables, Daedric Prey, and then 5 spammables. So again, it's another 12-second rotation here. So like the other rotations, the Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff. The Greater Storm Atro is cast whenever ready, and no dots need recasting. And then Barbed Trap is the only skill that he's keeping up dynamically. If you are running Medusa, you could just drop this completely and not worry about it. So the biggest downside to this rotation, since it's 12 seconds long, it means you're losing some uptime on your dots like Unstable Wall or Mystic Orb. But the upside of the rotation is that it's really easy to get perfect prey uptime since it's 12 seconds, and that is on a 6-second timer. And then it's also an easy rotation to track without timers. And then I wanted to present another alternate static version for the 2-pet rotation. This one might be a little more difficult as it operates off a 20-second rotation instead of a 12-second rotation, but it still does end up repeating itself. So for this one, we'll open up with our Tormentor, drop our ultimate to the side, hit our Volatile Familiar, and then drop our trap, and then we'll start our repeating rotation with Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, bar swap, Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, Daedric Prey, Volatile Familiar, bar swap, and then we do the Wall and Orb again, but then on our front bar, it's a little different. It is 3 spammables, Daedric Prey, 3 spammables, and then Volatile Familiar. So again, the Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff. Greater Storm Atro is cast whenever ready, and no dots need recasting, so we just replace one of those spammables with it. And the same with Barbed Trap. We will be keeping up that dynamically. It's the only skill that we'll have to actually pay attention to. So one of our spammables will be replaced with Barbed Trap anytime it needs to be laid down. Or if you're running Medusa, you can just scrap that part and not worry about it. So the downside to this rotation, because it's a 20-second rotation, that means we're going to lose some uptime on Daedric Prey to keep it static. And then for the upsides, good Wall, Orb, and Scamp uptime, and it's easy to track without timers as well. Now I'll go over the static version of the 1-pet rotation. So we'll open with the Tormentor, our ultimate to the side, and then drop our trap. And then the repeating part is Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Boundless Storm, and then Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, Daedric Prey, and then Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Barbed Trap, and then 3 spammables, Daedric Prey, 3 spammables. And so the back bar just kind of alternates between Boundless Storm and Barbed Trap, and then the front bar alternates with having Daedric Preys on the beginning and end of the rotation there, and then spammables at the beginning and the end of it with the Daedric Prey in the middle. So it just kind of flip-flops. So it might be a little tricky to get down at first, but once you get in the swing of it, it's pretty easy. So pretty much the same notes about the rotation as before. The downside to the rotation is Boundless Storm is cast a little too soon. Barbed Trap will lose a couple of seconds and be cast a little too late. And then Daedric Prey doesn't have perfect uptime as well. The upside to the rotation is great Wall and Orb uptime, and it's easy to track without timers. And then if you do want to run an execute with the 1-pet rotation, it's the same as from Wilfer's notes earlier. You'll drop your spammable at 20% and start running it. And then you'll drop Daedric Prey and Boundless Storm as well if you're going to get less than 17 seconds out of Boundless Storm. Then continue to fire your Crystal Fragments after 20%, even if you are running that execute. And again, this is optional. You can get pretty similar DPS by just repeating the initial rotation all throughout. All right, now we'll go through the 2-pet beginner rotation. So our OP opening will be Twilight Tormentor, Volatile Familiar, and then our ultimate. And you'll see I didn't put light attacks because we're going to cast these beforehand away from our target. So this is called pre-buffing. So we'll pre-buff these skills before we go into combat, and then we'll start with our rotation. So the repeating rotation will be Unstable Wall and Mystic Orb, and then we'll bar swap, cast Daedric Prey, 6 spammables, and then cast our Volatile Familiar again, and then that just repeats over and over. I definitely recommend running Medusa for the beginner setups, as you won't have to keep up Channeled Acceleration or Barbed Trap, and it does make the rotation a little bit easier. Here's the recommended skill bar setup as well. So for some notes on this, like the other rotations, the Twilight Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff. You won't actually ever activate it again during the fight. You'll drop your Storm Atro whenever it's ready and you aren't needing to recast any of your dots. And then Channel Acceleration can be cast before the start if you aren't running a set combination with Medusa. So the biggest downside of the rotation is the low Daedric Prey uptime, but there are some upsides. You get really good wall, orb, and scamp uptime, and it's really easy to track and it just repeats itself. So for the one pet beginner rotation, it's pretty similar. We just have room for Boundless Storm on our bar now. So we start with Boundless Storm, the Twilight Tormentor, and then our ultimate. And then we start our repeating part of our rotation with Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Daedric Prey, 7 spammables, and then Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Boundless Storm, Daedric Prey, and then 6 spammables. So you just cast the Boundless Storm every other rotation, and the rest is pretty much exactly repeating. We just have time for 1 less spammable on the second time around, so we'll do 6 instead of 7 since we are casting Boundless Storm. Again, the recommended gear is any of the combinations listed with Medusa. Then here are the recommended skills. And then for the notes, again, the Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff. The Greater Storm Atro is cast whenever ready and no dots need recasting. If you're not running Medusa, you can pre-cast Channeled Acceleration as well to get the Minor Force going. And then the downside of this rotation is low Daedric Prey uptime again, same as the other 2-pet beginner rotation. The upside though is good wall, orb, and Boundless Storm uptime, and it's again easy to track. And then finally, here is a no pet beginner rotation. Like I said a few times so far in this video, I really don't recommend a no pet. It's usually best to run at least the Twilight Tormentor. So I won't go through this, but I'll just put all this here and it'll be in the description as well for someone if they do want to run no pet. And then if you do want to run a no pet more advanced rotation, the idea is the same here, but you'll just cast wall and orb every 10 seconds and keep up Haunting Curse dynamically. All right, that's going to do it for the rotations. So one of the most common comments I see is that people are having trouble sustaining. Generally, in a well-optimized group, most of your sustain will come from your teammates through having lots of synergies, support sets like Worm and Hollowfang, and hopefully with high DPS, less time on your fights and less chance you'll run out of resources. However, sometimes you'll need to make some small changes to your build to avoid running out of your resources. Ideally, you'll want to change as little to your build as possible so that you have just enough to get by while sacrificing as little damage as possible. So in this section, I'll just run through some of the more common ways to get better sustain. Probably the least detrimental to your DPS, assuming you only have to do it once or twice, is heavy attacking. If you find yourself having to heavy attack often, it will be better to go with one of the other options I'll list. But if you can get by with only 1 or 2, then it's usually the easiest route to not have to change anything up and still get great damage. So ideally, you'll do this when your opponent is off balance, as the resource return from heavy attacks is doubled while an enemy is off balance. A couple of heavy attacks during this period will be a huge boost to your resources. Not to mention, heavy attacks also deal 70% more damage during off balance, so it's the best window to get that sustain boost and not lose much damage doing them as well. Another way you can improve your sustain, as I touched on earlier, is using crystal fragments as your spammable. There is that built-in feature that we talked about where you get 10% cost reduction to your next ability cast. This can be a nice way to get through a fight that you might normally not have quite enough resources for. Another really common option is using the set False God's Devotion. This is a great set to use as the 2 through 4 piece damage bonuses are perfect, and it has a little spell damage on the 5 piece as well to help it still deal good damage while being a great set for sustain. You'll mostly notice this set doing well if there are multiple enemies dying in a fight, and it won't shine as much in fights where you are only on one target. Another way to boost sustain is with the skill Dark Conversion. On PC, you can cast this before each fight and swap it off your bar with add-ons, but I know this isn't as easily doable on console. I almost always cast this before the start of the fight to give a little sustain boost to myself, and also to make sure that the group all gets Minor Prophecy 100% of the time, so they won't have to wait until I get a Crystal Fragments proc to give it to the group. Next up is the skill Consuming Trap. On some classes, I'd list this a little higher, but bar space is really tight on Magsork, so it can be tough to fit in. If there are side adds in a fight that you can apply this to, it can be absolutely huge in boosting your sustain. The side protectors in Asylum Sanctorium come to mind, as just casting this on them alone can be enough to sustain in the trial. The next option is using a one-piece monster set with recovery on it, or the set Grundwolf. Fully buffed, a one-piece recovery is about the same amount of mag recovery as you'd get from Grundwolf's two-piece bonus, if that bonus is activated on cooldown. Since Grundwolf's one piece is a crit line anyways, which is what you'd want to run on the other piece, it doesn't really matter which route you go. Grundwolf will give you a little stand back too though, if that's something that might help out with your current situation. Next up we have recovery glyphs. An absorb Magicka glyph instead of a flame glyph on our front bar will give us a very slight sustain increase, but also have the least negative impact on our DPS of the glyph options. A recovery glyph on our jewelry is another option, though it will be more of a negative impact on our DPS. With the new buffs to major and minor intellect to 40 and 20%, a recovery glyph on a Magsork is going to add somewhere close to 350 Magicka recovery. So it will be more noticeable than running an absorb mag glyph on our front bar, but also a bigger DPS hit. Then you could also swap out your weapon damage enchant on your infused back bar to an absorb Magicka enchant and see a really big sustain boost at an even larger DPS loss though. Remember, always start as small as you can with the adjustments and then go from there. Then finally we have the option to run the Clockwork Citrus Fillet Food instead of Artean Pickled Fishbowl. The damage difference on this, assuming this allows you to keep everything else in your build as a full damage setup, is not too bad. The biggest downside to this food, in my opinion, is the lower health. It won't be a big deal in some content, but after buffs, you end up losing over 3k health making this swap, which is no small chunk. I generally recommend this as one of the last options to swap to if you need sustain help, but it can be nice for sustain if you're okay with that lower health pool. Oh man, this was a long one. That's going to be the end of this guide though. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this video helps you get the most out of your Magsork. I'll let the video play out with the 2-pet static rotation from BH Nunez, a 2-pet dynamic rotation from Rosskag, a 1-pet dynamic rotation parse from Wilfer, and a clip from me in Kind's Aegis hard mode against Captain Vrol. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
set for just all.
Thanks again for watching. I wanted to give a special shout out to a great friend of mine, WTF Pone87. He is one of the few people I know outside of the gaming world, actually understands what's going on with all this YouTube and Twitch stuff I've been doing, and he's been extremely supportive of me making content since day one. Always asking how it's going, offering advice and suggestions, and being positive and uplifting about my progress and how I can do better. Just wanted to say thanks, man. It really means a lot, and it's nice to have a friend I know in real life that I can talk to and share this stuff with. Adios, amigo.